Greetings everyone, I am the Mad Scientist, aka Dr. J. I may joke about how I play Nami and Nami in order to get up the rank ladder, but that's only half true. It's virtually impossible to climb the ladder without at least one good fallback. In the support role, as much as I might want to say that Nami can be picked into anything, that's not necessarily the case. Even if you do well in the laning phase, if your team doesn't have a solid initiator or is on the squishy side, it can be hard to close out a game, even if you rush lock it. As a result, when that situation arises, I rely on the champion I hate going up against the most while playing Nami, Thresh. I know I'm essentially giving away how to play the one champion I despise going up against, but knowing how to play as him does teach you a decent amount about how to work against him. With that said,
what delightful agony we shall inflict.
This is my Thresh guide. Thresh is a tanky support, whose job is to single out enemy targets to be blown up by his allies. Between Thresh and Nami, I seldom ever need to play any other support, simply because both of them can adapt well to any team composition that solo queue can throw at you. He has a lot of utility, both offensive and defensive, that allows him to be a menace no matter who you're playing with or against. He is one of the best champions in this game to first pick, as he's a really good champion that doesn't reveal too much of your team's potential strategy or team comp. However, he's not a perfect champion. As with Nami, in order to do well with him, you are required to land skill shots. The hook isn't as hard to land as some others, but it's still important to land, and one of his other abilities is a nightmare to get right. Since the hook also has a wind-up animation, that makes it slightly easier to dodge, even if you can get over aiming it. I recommend using Smartcast once that you're used to the ranges on all of his abilities to put less button presses in between you and your target. Even if you yourself are technically competent at Thresh though, I cannot necessarily recommend him to most low elo players, as he not only relies on you knowing how to react, but also requiring your allies to know what they're doing. Blitzcrank is usually better to punish the poor positioning at low elo, and Thresh does take a lot of time to get right due to his unique abilities. Beyond that, he does struggle with two major problems in his toolkit. The first is the jack-of-all-trades syndrome, where he ranges from good to decent on a lot of things, but doesn't particularly excel at any one area. Pretty much any support in this game can do something better than you. Tank supports can out-tank you, sustain supports can outlast you, and poke supports can out-damage you. His toolkit is a very potent combination if used right, but if you're forced to act on the enemy's terms, you're going to be at an inherent disadvantage. The second major issue is that he can sometimes fall into a feast or famine trap. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, what this means is that Thresh tends to do either really well or really badly. How well you are able to take and maintain control of the laning phase and the early game in general can have a direct impact on your general power, beyond just the variance in gold. Level 1 is a crucial moment to win, as if he doesn't do so, that can be, well, a death sentence for him. That being said, though he may struggle with the feast or famine issues, the utility in his toolkit does allow a skilled player to make the comeback real. He has enough tankiness, crowd control, and kiting power to fit well into any team, and with any luck, Riot now thinks that they've nerfed him enough at this point. Even if you get another initiator on your team, it still helps to have another way in which you can set the terms for a team fight, and his defensive power allows him to effectively kite, with one of his abilities allowing him to bail out allies even if he arrives late to the party, assuming your allies know to click on the damn thing. If you're able to look past the weaknesses I've mentioned, you will find a very tough champion who has a lot of potential to be awesome, and has remained a well-known and respected pick as a result of that. Now that you understand the basics, let's look at his abilities. His passive, Damnation, prevents him from gaining armor per level. Instead, he collects the souls of fallen enemies by walking up next to them when they appear, each of which gives him a small amount of armor and ability power. They must be collected within 8 seconds of being dropped before they disappear, with large monsters, large minions, and champions always dropping one, and small minions and monsters having a 1 in 3 chance of dropping one. This is the main reason why Thresh can fall into a feast or famine trap. If he isn't allowed to collect souls, then he will find himself with a tangible decrease in power. Because of this, it's important to assert yourself in lane early on so that you're able to go into the enemy's minion wave without being immediately mauled for it. It's not worth taking a lot of damage just to wander over and grab one soul, or risk losing your life over it if the enemy has some powerful crowd control. His Q is Death Sentence, the most important skill shot in your arsenal. After a short channel time, Thresh throws out a hook that deals magic damage to the first enemy it hits, and pulls the target towards him in 2 short pulls. The hook functions as a stun while the target is standing still, and a knockback while being pulled. While you are tethered to an enemy, you are unable to auto-attack, but pressing Q again will cause you to move towards the enemy hit while you are connected to them. I recommend that you wait for both pulls to happen before doing so, as pressing Q before then will partially shorten the pull's distance. After the stun duration is over, your opponent is free to move, and unless they time their escape spells perfectly, there is a chance that they will use them while you're moving towards them, causing you to follow along for the ride. Keep this in mind if you're looking to try and catch an enemy out while their escape spell is up. This is another skill that can cause him to have a feast or famine issue, as the cooldown is very high but will be reduced by a small amount if you're able to land it. That means that if you can consistently hit it, you'll get even more chances to do so, while getting punished with a longer cooldown if you fail. Fortunately, the cooldown is triggered regardless of what you hit, so even if you accidentally secure a minion with your hook, then you will still be able to use it sooner rather than later. It is still bad that you missed the champion though, and you should feel bad. In order to help you land it, keep in mind the terrain and the tendencies of the enemy champions. I've talked about unit pathing in a previous guide, so here's the short version. Whenever we move across the map, the game logic gives us the shortest path to whatever point we choose. This tends to navigate us against the walls and makes it harder to dodge projectiles because we don't have as much freedom of movement. An enemy in between their turret and the wall is often easy pickings for a line skill shot, because their ability to dodge it is horrendously limited. There is another nuance to the terrain though, and that is bush control. Vision is power, and if you can assert control of the side brush early on, that gives you the element of surprise, increasing the likelihood of landing it by taking away their ability to see the wind-up animation. There aren't trinkets to prevent that sort of thing from happening too often, but if you force them to use a trinket, it won't last forever, and that's one less ward they can use to watch for jungle ganks. As for the tendencies of the enemy champions, there are 2 common reactions when they see you going for a hook. There are the smart summoners who try to sidestep it, and the idiots who will try and outrun it. The last one is a bit of a harsh generalization, so let me explain. The ones that sidestep it have seen enough Thresh players to where they can usually predict where the hook is going and how to avoid it. Utilizing the terrain is the best way to deal with this kind of player, although if they're really smart, they won't be caught in anything blindingly obvious. Still, everyone makes mistakes, and even at my elo I've seen over-aggression kill more than once. The idiots that don't understand a sidestep usually don't intend to get hit by the hook, only actual trolls and pure tanks will care less, but got hit due to not reacting quickly enough, or because they misclicked and simply walked into it. Since that most summoners are clicking all the time to ensure they can more effectively react when something does happen, that can often work against them if their movement becomes too predictable. It also doesn't help that the direction you're facing doesn't actually affect where the hook goes, which means if you appear to be walking away and trying to hook an invisible minion in a bush, they could still end up getting nailed by it. Figure out which one your enemy is and exploit them in any way you can. His W is Dark Passage, the ability your allies will forget to click on. Upon casting, Thresh throws out his lantern within a radius around him, shielding any friendly champion, including yourself, within a small radius around it. Any allied champion who right-clicks on it will be pulled towards Thresh, bringing the shield with him. Moving too far away from the lantern after placing it will also withdraw the lantern towards him, once again bringing the shield with it. It can also be used to remotely pick up souls, at the cost of putting it on the high cooldown. This has the potential to be a game-changing ability, but depending on your allies, it might just be a very weak AoE shield. This is the primary reason why I have trouble recommending Thresh to low elo summoners, because even if they themselves are mechanically skilled, reminding your allies of its existence can be hard to do. There is a lot of potential awesomeness with it though, either while using it to help allies escape, or to bring them in closer once you've caught an enemy out. It's a cool ability, but it can be a bit lackluster if you're not in a pre-made group. If you're determined to play him, in most cases you will want to throw it slightly in the direction your ally is fleeing, in order to ensure they're more likely to notice it and reduce the chance of the enemy huddling around it. His E is Flay, which has both an active and passive component. The active component is a rectangular skill shot around him. All enemies caught inside of it get knocked in the direction of your cursor, take magic damage, and receive a short slow afterward. The passive component gives you increased damage on your auto attacks, with this damage increasing based on ability level, the number of souls you've collected, and how long it's been since your last auto attack. You can see how much damage the passive has built up by looking at the icon above your abilities bar and listening for an audio cue once it's reached the cap. This is your primary damage source during the laning phase, as both the active and passive can add up to a lot once you've dumped some levels into it. It can help to equalize the damage that a poke support can throw at you without needing to burn through your mana, albeit putting you in some danger due to the low range of your auto attacks. The problem that this has in lane is that using it next to minions could cause the lane to be pushed more than you like, and your opponents aren't likely to let you close enough to flay them unless you've already hooked them or they're a tanky support, in which case why are you so close to them? It is still good for continuing to displace the enemy in order for your allies to leave their mark, and the slow component is deceptively powerful. This ability may not be the most important skill shot to get right, but it is definitely the hardest. Mastery of this skill separates the good Thresh players from the godly ones. By utilizing the knockback effect correctly, you can halt enemy mobility spells after they've been cast, be it an enemy initiator wanting to jump on you, or an enemy trying to get away. It's really hard to do, but if you can pull it off, it feels awesome to have that sort of control over the enemy. His ultimate is the Box, a simple name for your enemy's worst nightmare. After a short cast time, he summons a pentagon around him. Enemy champions hit by one of the sides will consume that side of the pentagon, taking magic damage and a powerful slow. An enemy can hit the box multiple times, with the slow being partially reapplied but without taking any more magic damage. This ability is useful both offensively and defensively, either by dissuading or halting an enemy's engagement, or forcing the carry to deal with you once you've come in with death sentence. Just be mindful of the delay on this ability, as it can be hard to snag someone with the edge of it that's running away from you, assuming you can't already hit them with death sentence or flay. Even if your enemy has an escape spell, unless it's a blink like flash, they will still hit the wall, or you can force them to hit the wall by using one of your many knockbacks. Now let's look at your upgrade path. There are two kinds of people who play Thresh, those that start with death sentence, and those that start with flay. Before I say which side I'm on, let's take a look at the merits of both. Starting death sentence gives you the opportunity to invade the enemy jungle early on. As though your hook might not be as devastating as the blitz grab, the amount of time spent in the hook itself can leave enough of a mark to give your team first blood. You lose some poke in the early game, but if you can land it onto an enemy carry early on, that can give you a lot of free damage onto them with which to snowball the lane. Starting with flay gives you increased poke due to the passive increasing the damage on your auto attacks. It will allow you to give a better leash to your jungler, and give you both offensive power to assert close range dominance on a squishy target, and defensive power to slow down the enemy jungler if he shows up. With that said, I prefer to start with death sentence. I have won lanes purely off of landing the first hook on a carry. The ability for your carry to land a ton of harass without nearly as much risk is too much to pass up on, as it can be such a game changer early on even if you don't invade the jungle. At the very least, it will force the enemy into an engagement they don't want, and at best, you've just allowed your carry to get both an auto attack and a skill shot on them, and maybe even first blood. It doesn't have the same defensive power that Flay does, but the enemy laners aren't likely to get that close to you uninvited for it to be worthwhile, and most junglers start at their buff closest to the bottom lane, so by the time you see action down there, you'll usually have both. Even if the jungler starts at the other buff, it means the enemy has more time to try and gain a level advantage on you, and in that case, it's even more important to assert dominance over the enemy laners. After death sentence, grab Flay at level 2 for the defensive and offensive power, and the Lantern at level 3. Afterward, I recommend maxing Flay first. The passive on Flay isn't bound to a skill shot and will give you a higher damage output overall. Though you won't get the lower cooldown on death sentence, your hook isn't as meaningful as the blitz grab and not as essential early game. Flay gives you the damage you need to trade blows with supports who rely on a lot of poke, as well as making it easier to secure kills once your hook does land. Max death sentence second, max the Lantern last, and upgrade your ultimate whenever it is available. With abilities out of the way, let's look at our build, starting with our rune page. For marks, you have a choice between armor marks or hybrid penetration. Armor marks are overall good for any support to have, as you may often find yourself taking a lot of damage from the minion wave and the enemy carry. Hybrid penetration is a little more unconventional on Thresh, but I feel it is a viable alternative, allowing him overall more effectiveness with his Flay passive and just for being a nasty threat. In most cases, I personally prefer armor, as I tend to play better when I'm a tanky menace rather than a more damaging menace. It's cool that you as a support can deal a beating, but that's not your primary focus, so I prefer armor. For glyphs, you will want either flat magic resistance or scaling magic resistance. The question regarding this choice is whether you are more afraid of the enemy's support damage now, or whether you are more afraid of the enemy mid laner's damage later. In most cases, since the early game is so crucial for you, it's usually better to run flat magic resist, especially since you'll be buying plenty of magic resistance later. You might have noticed that I glossed over seals, which is traditionally done before looking at glyphs, and there's a reason for that. For tanky supports, it's customary to run armor seals and health quids, armor to mitigate damage from auto attacks, and health as an overall buffer to your survivability. However, a comment in my Nami guide got me thinking about the math behind this, and after a quick comparison, I found that for what I'm looking for in the laning phase, you get more of a benefit from running health seals and armor quins rather than the other way around. You lose 6 health in the trade-off, but gain 4 armor, and since that I'm supposed to be in the enemy's face trying to initiate despite minions and the damage coming from a carry, I value that 4 armor more than that 6 health. With the nerf to armor seals, they still are effective, but slowly introducing health seals and armor quins to my tanky support page has made a major difference to my early game success. It's a nitpick, and I will understand if you use armor seals and health quins, but the small advantages that you can find can often be the most important. For masteries, I use a 0-21-9 set, putting focus into extra armor, health, and tenacity. Since that it's key to win the early game with Thresh, it's important to ensure that you are able to effectively handle the damage coming at you from the opposing laners, and the extra armor and health help to mitigate that for both the enemy minion wave and the enemy carry. The points in utility focus on helping us out overall, with the extra potion effectiveness helping our sustain, and the summoner spell cooldown, extra movement speed, and faster recall helping us to move around more effectively as the game drags on. Your summoner spells are somewhat up to personal preference. Flash is a given no matter what you do, as it's a really good get out of jail free card, and is also nice for getting a surprise hook, as well as using it with the lantern to double the impact it may have. For your other summoner spell, it's a hard choice between a spell that can render someone useless for a short time, or one that quickens their death. I am biased in this decision since I come from a background of defensive supports, as even when Ignite was really popular, I was still using Exhaust as my second summoner spell. As a support, I tend to value controlling the field over outright killing it, and given that usually the defense of a carry will fall onto the support, even if you're playing an offensive one, it's good to have this. Even if your crowd control isn't enough, then you throw down Exhaust to continue making them unable to fight back. Ignite can still be useful to secure a kill, especially in the early game, but I feel that being able to completely shut down someone's damage for that crucial moment is too much to pass up on. Your starting items are more flexible than with other supports, partially because there isn't a great option for them. Ancient Coin will give you guaranteed gold if you're able to stay in lane, as well as a really good active, but leaves you squishier than you might like early on. Relic Shield can be nice to give you some sustain, but that's assuming that you can last hit, and if your allies will even allow you to last hit anything. Even then, while the stats on it might be good for you, the active is definitely the weakest and least useful of the other support items. Dorn's Shield is the most gold efficient and gives him the most tankiness early on, but if you can't zone the carry away from some CS or kill someone, then the enemy support is going to get a gold lead by virtue of attrition with their own gold generation item. For better or worse, there is no single right or wrong answer. In most cases, I would say go with Relic Shield, with the assumption that you're actually able to last hit. Trust me, your carry will not appreciate it if you fail to secure the cannon minion. It strikes a good balance between gold generation and actually being tanky, and the sustain it offers will help you against some poke conks if you fall behind. The shield active on the final upgrade isn't as overall useful as the talisman active, but it can still be useful for keeping a carry alive, especially if you're forced to play more defensively. The main exception to this is if your team isn't very mobile, in which case it would be better to go with Ancient Coin for that mobility later on. It's a sacrifice to your early game, but if your team isn't very mobile, it often is a necessary sacrifice. If you are grabbing Doran's Shield, take an extra health potion to help your sustain, as well as the warding trinket. If you're going Ancient Coin, grab a sight ward, extra health potion, and the warding trinket. If you're going Relic Shield, Take 2 health potions as well as a mana potion to make up for your lack of early mana regen. On your first recall, if you're able to get Sightstone, do it. Everyone may have a trinket now, but that doesn't mean that vision is any less important. Grab the sweeper trinket at the same time in order to reduce the effectiveness of the enemy's wards, especially around the dragon pit and in the side brush. If you are unable to get Sightstone, either grab the upgrade to your gold generation item, start on Ancient Coin in the case of Dorn Shield, or grab a ruby crystal in preparation for Sightstone. Grab 1 or 2 health potions if you see the laning phase dragging on, and possibly a mana potion if you find yourself struggling in that regard. Also, don't forget to pick up vision wards in order to help ensure that you can take key jungle objectives across the map. You already have Sightstone, but that doesn't mean you're completely exempt from buying vision wards, especially if your allies choose not to help with vision a whole lot. After both your gold generation item has been upgraded and you have Sightstone, then it's time to pick up boots to help when you begin roaming around the map. Your choices are between Mercury's Treads and Boots of Mobility. In most cases, I would say Mercury's Treads is the best way to go, as it might limit your ability to roam, but will give you a decent amount of mobility and tenacity to stay close to an enemy. Mobility boots can be good if you're trying to get used to roaming, but they end up being a crutch after a while due to the reduced movement speed while in combat, so go with Mercury's Treads. The only exception to this is when the enemy is an all-attack damage team, and in that case, grab Ninja Tabby. Take Home Guard for your enchantment, and pick it up whenever you need to get back to the fray in a hurry. Your next few items will depend on the circumstances of the game, primarily based on who is the most fed on the enemy team and who you need to worry about the most. If you need magic resistance, or you're against a team with a heavy AoE presence, Aegis of the Legion into Locket of the Iron Solari is your best bet. I can understand being hesitant about buying Aegis if the enemy only has one source of magic damage, but unless that damage is coming from a defensive or tank support, that only means it's even more important to get Aegis, as it means your allies aren't going to be spending as many item slots to deal with a magic damage threat, if at all. If you need to deal with enemy physical damage, you have a few options available to you. Most high-end armor items start out with a chain vest as one of their components, so grab this if you have the gold and are having trouble deciding what to get next. With that said, you have 3 options once you've gotten that chain vest: Randuin's Omen, Sunfire Cape, and Frozen Heart. If you need cooldown reduction and won't mind having some extra mana, then Frozen Heart is a good one to pick up. The attack speed reduction aura will affect any enemy near you, and doesn't require them to focus you in order to take full effect. Randuin's Omen gives you overall more durability, since it gives you both health and armor, as well as an AoE movement speed slow around you. It's nice to have that slow if you don't have the box up, but if you have both available, they can be a little redundant. Sunfire Cape is perhaps the least useful of these, as the enemy aren't likely to let you stay up next to them uninvited, and even if you do get up next to them, it doesn't necessarily do a whole lot in the long run. It also prevents you from walking up next to enemy champions under a turret, or from walking next to Baron without taking damage for it, so it's overall a choice between cooldown reduction, mana, and a bunch of armor, versus slightly less armor, a bunch of health, and an extra AoE slow. If you don't desperately need either one, then it's usually best to either start on Aegis in preparation for any issues with AoE spells, or to finish off your gold generation item. If you're running Relic Shield, it's not as much of a priority, but if you're going Ancient Coin, then it is always going to be appreciated for that extra mobility, and you should grab it as soon as you can fit it into your build. Another item that I've seen a lot of Thresh players run is Mikhail's Crucible. I will admit, I understand why people do it, but I don't agree that it's as important as people make it out to be. The infinite mana passive is where most of the cost of Chalice gets dumped into. The regen from the other component item is redundant because of that, and since Thresh doesn't struggle with mana apart from the first few levels, then it doesn't seem worth it. Sure, the active is powerful, and he won't say no to extra magic resistance and cooldown reduction, but I feel that you spend far too much to forget about the active or maybe save someone in that crucial team fight. If I'm doing my job right, then my carry shouldn't necessarily need that assistance, and since I prefer the Relic Shield start, I'm already giving them some extra protection to begin with, and while it might not be as powerful, it is on a much lower cooldown. At the same time, I am human, so is my carry, and both of us are likely to screw up somewhere along the line. And for those of you who don't mind dumping an insane amount of gold into this, it can help to resolve any major mistake. I personally would only pick it up if the enemy has some really powerful crowd control that must be removed right this instant. Otherwise, the stats aren't very useful on him to justify it. Depending on whether you take Crucible, that leaves us 1 or 2 slots open for that once in a century when you are able to actually top off your build. Often I find myself filling those up with more tankiness to make myself even more of an impervious nuisance to any enemy who thinks they can outlast me. To serve this purpose, any one of the armor options I've mentioned will work, and if you need magic resistance, Spirit Visage is a really nice go-to for that. I wouldn't recommend going with Warmog's armor, as it's too easy to have that item shut down by a Blade of the Ruined King, and you can usually make better use of your money on other items. When it comes to the early game, I've said it plenty of times already and I'll say it again. Level 1 is a crucial period for you to win. Most junglers start with their buff next to the bottom lane, so you'll be arriving to lane at about the same time as your opponent. Once you get there, start hitting the minion wave in order to both limit the effectiveness of the enemy minions when you look for a fight, and to beat your opponents to level 2. While doing this, look for a chance to hook the enemy carry, and if you hit your mark, auto-attack him immediately afterward. If your carry is able to follow up, then you are guaranteed to land a ton of damage onto him before he can respond, although his support may try and curtail that usefulness with their own crowd control. Against some bottom lane matchups, it shouldn't be too hard to find an engagement, but there are a couple of times that you will want to engage more so than others. First is when you are under your turret and they are moving to harass you. Whenever someone damages a champion underneath their turret, that causes the turret to switch focus to them, and if you can land death sentence right as tower aggro switches over, you are guaranteed a summoner spell, and if they don't have a summoner spell or a lot of health, they are going back to base a lot earlier than they may have liked to. Another good time to go for it is when they've hit you with some of their own crowd control, as that gives them the perception of you being weak. It isn't an ideal circumstance, as you've already taken some damage before you can retaliate, but it does mean that when the enemy comes for you, it will be easier to land a hook and bait out a fight in your favor, especially if your jungler is nearby. While you are looking for an opportunity to strike, not only should you pay attention to everyone's health bars and position, but also the relative strength of the minion wave. It's easy to say that if the enemy has the larger minion wave, then it makes it harder to land a hook, but there's more to it than that. How much damage the minions can actually do is something important to keep in mind, as minion aggro can add up to a lot over time. The best way to see this in action is to sit and tank them for a while. They can hurt if you let them. Fortunately, their aggro is fairly easy to understand. Auto-attacking an enemy champion will cause the minions to switch focus onto you, but none of your spells will trigger minion aggro if you hit a champion. Bush control is essential if you're looking to harass the enemy, as moving into an unwarded bush will cause the minions to lose sight of you and go back to fighting each other. This is also an effective way to tell if the enemy has warded a bush, because if they can still see you, the minions will keep attacking you until you walk far enough away from them. Sometimes you may also want to use this minion aggro in your favor, as landing an early auto attack onto a champion and then holding minion aggro for a little bit will mean that your minion wave will end up killing theirs faster, allowing you to push and gain a level advantage off of that. Another little trick you can use to see if a bush is warded is to stand next to a minion wave and stop moving without actually using the stop button. I have my auto attack set to attack by default, hence the name, which means if I'm close enough to a champion or minion outside the bush, and they have vision of me, I will, according to the game's logic, be in vision of them and will attack. However, Thresh's auto attack range is not very long, so be careful if you mean to take advantage of this against an enemy champion, as if they can see you, they can also hit you with their own skill shots. Whenever the enemy jungler shows up, Flay is your best friend, knocking them back and buying yourself a little more time to run away. Using it will make you immobile, and easier to nail with a skill shot as a result, but the idea isn't to keep yourself alive, it's to keep the carry alive. Remember the lantern, either to pull an AD carry away from the front, or to simply give you enough health to ensure you survive. If your jungler shows up, the best thing you can do is throw back the lantern and then immediately hook the enemy you intend to kill. This way, they won't be able to react in time to effectively deal with the jungler coming to the party, and at the very least, you'll burn a summoner spell or force recall. Just be careful not to act too aggressively when the jungler shows up, as depending on your elo, that can be a dead giveaway that a jungler is nearby. Also be careful to not send out the lantern too soon, as that can also be a dead giveaway. You can use it for a nice fake out doing this, but be careful, as even though you are decently tanky, the last thing you want to do is give up a kill or potentially put it on that higher cooldown. When the mid and late game arrive, your first priority is to determine what role you're going to be playing when teamfights happen, initiator versus defender. As an initiator, you'll be catching out squishy or high priority targets and either leading the charge or following up on it. As a defender, your job will be to ensure that your high damage threats remain alive, and are allowed to be as effective as possible. In most games, you are likely to play some sort of combination of the two, and this will change not only on a game-by-game basis, but a team-fight-by-team fight basis. In order to help determine which you should focus on, take a look at the champions on your team and the reason why you likely picked Thresh. Protecting Ezreal or Caitlyn is going to be less important than protecting Vayne or Jinx, as the former have their own escape spells, and the latter are hyper carries who are much more important to keep alive. At the same time, there will be situations in which you need to be the first in the fray regardless of your carries, be it because you're the only one with a gap closer besides just running at the enemy frontline, or if you're the only tanky champion your team has and need to draw fire away from the assassins or bruisers. Since you are likely to play the initiator in most cases, here are some general tips for initiation. First, and perhaps most important, remember to be patient. If you try hard enough, you can always get a fight, but that doesn't mean you'll get a winning fight. Your enemies are human. Wait for their carry to poke his head out a little too far and then make him regret his bravery. Along with that, ensure that your allies are also able to follow up with your engagement. It's easy to find a time when you can dive onto the enemy. It's a lot harder to find a time when your team will be ready for it. Be sure to utilize pings to increase the chances that your allies will know to act the moment a hook lands, but if you don't have someone who can easily help you out, just hang back and wait for the proper moment to strike. The screw up will come, all you need is patience. Second, be sure that you are going for the right target. This will vary depending on who is fed and where everyone is positioned, but in general, your priorities follow this order. Always take an opportunity to catch out a hyper carry over everyone else, as if they are allowed to auto attack without being contested, they will make you regret it. If your opponent doesn't have a hyper carry, then choose between who is more powerful, the caster or the carry. Usually the carry will take precedence if they're about equal, as a caster can usually get their burst off before you can kill them, and once that burst is gone, they're not nearly as much of a threat to you, or more importantly, your turrets. From there, pretty much any squishy target is fair game, be it an assassin, caster support, or other squishy target. After everyone is down that could be a major threat, then you can turn your attention to the tanky champions. Even if you think that a tank's allies won't get close enough to be a threat before you can take him down, when in doubt, they can get close enough, and I've seen games won because someone got a little too greedy for that tank goal. As for playing defensively, what you do there is essentially a ramped up version of how you handle jungle ganks. Use the lantern to drag allies toward you, forcing the enemy to deal with Flay and the box if they want to continue chasing. If they dive behind you, then you can use Death Sentence defensively in order to drag them away, and to help you close in to apply your other crowd control. Take advantage of your item's active abilities whenever possible, and even if you end up dying, as long as your carry is allowed to attack uncontested, job well done to you. So there you have it, everything that I, as a Nami main, have to say about the one champion I hate facing above all others. He's definitely not my best champion, as you can probably tell by looking at the gameplay, but when I do mess up, perhaps it can be useful as a means of showing you what not to do. To those of you who have made it to the end of this, thank you so much for doing so. Please like and share this video if you enjoyed it or learned something from it, and keep an eye on this channel for more champion guides and other content posted on a not so regular basis. Good luck if you intend to use Thresh in ranked, but whatever you may do, I wish you the best of luck on the fields of justice.